Magandang umaga sa lahat. It's really nice. I'm actually back in the Philippines. I was here about 20 years ago for 6 weeks and have been here for a week and have been really enjoying it. So Sarah Domingo, who I assume many of you will know, who was here at Ateneo and now is with us in New Zealand pursuing a PhD, invited me to come and to talk about Korean popular culture and also to talk about the book that was mentioned, the Korean Way, a source book. And I realized only fairly late in my preparations that there's a bit of a difference in trying to think about that Korean Way source book and talking about Korean popular culture. Because there is the issue of understanding Korean popular culture within Korea, and then there's the issue of understanding the global spread of Korean popular culture. And for those of you who are teaching here in the Philippines, you probably want to know, what does it mean to your students? And how do you use it to teach about Korea, to engage your students? And what I'd like to do in my session today, I've got a really eclectic set of things to talk about. Basically what I'm trying to do is to distill a whole course that I teach on modern Korean society and pull out bits and pieces that I think are relevant, that are interesting, that you might use. And also I know that you have a very long day ahead of you. So instead of this being a lecture, let's make it more like a lecture seminar. At any point, please feel free to raise your hands, ask questions so that we get it to be like a conversation for the start. I think it'll make it more lively. That's for the participants and also for my colleagues, esteemed colleagues who are here. Please feel free to interrupt. And what I'd also like to do, I was thinking, okay, so I don't know what your situations really are like here in your high schools and what you want to teach, but I'm trying to think for myself in teaching my students, how do I engage them? How do I make them interested in Korea using popular culture and to think about some important issues and to get them to approach the world in a more critical, engaged, and informed way. And I suppose, however you have your unit set up, but one of the things to just talk about is just thinking about what is popular culture, and to start looking at that from a larger level. Because I think sometimes when we think of popular culture, mostly we're thinking about popular culture texts. So dramas and music and so on, but we can also think of popular culture as just the daily culture of lived life. The way that we engage with the world around us, whether it's through things like, the internet, or there are many things in life that both affect popular culture and are affected by popular culture, and in particular because you're coming from the education system itself, we can regard at one level as an aspect, I think, of popular culture. There are ways in which this will slide into trying to understand society and the connections between them. And so with Dr. Reed later on, I think there will be some overlap because these things sort of go back and forth. More specifically within that is once you might start getting them to think about what popular culture and how they understand popular culture, but also what is Korean popular culture? How do they understand Korean popular culture? And how do they understand it from the perspectives of being here in the Philippines? And over the last week, one of the differences, actually, I was just asked how things have changed in the last 20 years. One very clear change, as I think about it, is the obvious presence of Korea in the Philippines. 20 years ago, I don't think I would have seen any Korean signs. I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of Korean restaurants here. That is another example. So there's an awareness, I think, of a connection between Korea and the Philippines. And also I've seen quite a few Koreans here. I suppose you would have heard about this yesterday, thinking about Korean-Filipino relations as well. And in fact, in my Asian society course, I do a lecture that looks about intra-Asian tourism. And one of the questions I ask them, my students, is what country is the greatest supplier of tourists to the Philippines? Because it's kind of I wouldn't call it a trick question, but it is surprising to think about the fact that it's Korea, South Korea, overwhelmingly in fact. And some of that has to do with the way connections have been established, but also to get them to think about institutional structures that need to be in place. The fact that it's not so far and that you have multiple plane flights going back, entry into different places here. So those are some of the things that get involved. So you can be asking them, what do they know about Korea? Start from that. What are their interests? Do you have students who are particularly interested in K-pop, for instance? And maybe there's more of that in the high schools. One of the things that, from my own relatively limited knowledge of Hallyu, or the Korean wave, in the Philippines, is that it's been particularly driven by drama over the years. That more than some other markets where it's been music, here it has been drama. So you can also think, and to look at specific texts that they may be responding to. So things from films, more specifically, drama, music, games, and as well. And to think of gaming culture is actually a very important part of Korean popular culture. A lot of scholars, in fact, who look at Korean pop culture tend to leave gaming outside, even though that is by far the biggest economic export in the popular culture realm from Korea. That's where, by far, it's the most money that is brought in to the country. Today, for myself, when I look more at specific texts, I'll be talking about music. I don't tend to focus very much on drama in my own research. It's kind of a black hole for me in my Korean pop culture research. But one of the things in looking at the reception of dramas here in the Philippines that's really interesting is when you look at local reception and people liking Korean dramas, they talk about, oh, it's very fresh, it's new, not high production value, sure, but they say like our own homegrown dramas in the past were very cliched and formulaic, but the Korean stuff brought something really fresh, which is interesting because sometimes from the outside in other places there have been critiques of Korean dramas for being very cliched and so on. So it's interesting to see that there's that sort of dialectic engagement that's going on there as well. But you can ask what it is. So that's, I think, one of the issues that you'll want to ask them. Why has Korean pop culture caught on here? And that's an example of what is going on maybe from drama. And why has it caught on more broadly? What is the appeal for Korea? Or why has Korea become such a major popular culture exporter around the world? There are a lot of interesting things going on within that for them to be thinking about, that I'll touch upon further as I go on. Also, I think that one of the interesting things for me, I'd say, in my own approach to Korean popular culture is when we look at texts, when we look at Korean music or look at Korean film, it really reveals to us a lot about Korean society. So if you want to teach about Korea, if you can get in bits and pieces of episodes from dramas or from films or even a K-pop video, often you can do a lot with just a single video and try to read it, try to understand it. Ask your students to think about the different images they're seeing. What does it tell us about views, about gender, about masculinity and femininity, and so on. Those are a lot of interesting things that are going on there. And another really interesting area about Korean popular culture is to think what it tells us about the world today and how media structures are changing today. And one of the things, just to look at it ahead, why Korea has been so successful is maybe more than any other single country, Korea has managed to capitalize on digital platforms to spread its culture around the world. And that, I'll say a bit more later about the contrast between Korea and Japan. Little things like attitudes of copyright and so on. That comes in. But from my own perspective, in looking at this spread of Korean popular culture, another question you can get them to think about, and I think it's important from the perspective of the Philippines. And with Sarah, the last time I met with her, she gave a talk at an association that we have called the World Association of Hallyu Studies. So studying the Korean wave. And you might think that a World Association of Hallyu Studies is in place for everybody to go, yay, Korean wave, go, to see that it is spreading around the world. And I think in a lot of the ways, that's what the Korean government and Korean business interests would like. And I am certainly grateful to the Korea Foundation for bringing me here so I can be talking to you. But it's part of a mission of cultural diplomacy. But the cultural diplomacy is also meant to pave the way for spreading Korean interests, to make money for the nation, but also to raise its soft power, its standing in the world. And at one level, I think that's natural, that's fine. Almost every country wants to see itself regarded, highly regarded around the world. New Zealand has its own film industry, Lord of the Rings, you may be familiar with. We have our own version of soft power. But in the Korean case, and I think often looking at this, and maybe in the Philippines more than almost any market, you understand cultural imperialism pretty well with the experience of Spanish colonization, and then the US, and adding Japan, and now what is Korea doing here? So Sarah's talk was a lot about attitudes towards a certain amount of cultural imperialism in the Korean way. And I think when you're talking with your students, you can say, hey, there's this great stuff about Korea, but what else is going on here? And to try and look at these larger issues. So these are some of the things that you might be able to generate a lot of really great discussion around popular culture with Korea. So that's just by way of introduction into some of the big questions. And what I want to do here is just say a bit about the contexts of Korean popular culture and the Korean wave, Hallyu, and then for Hallyu, looking more specifically at Korean pop culture and how it relates to its neighboring countries, and the way that you see that it has an impact on how it engages with places nearby. Then I want to talk more about K-pop specifically and how it has spread more broadly around the world. And then, since I do have a bit of a captive audience, I'm going to talk about an area that I find more fun and interesting at the end, and to present one of the documentaries, which is on a different side of music from Korea, that gives a different sense of what Korea might be about, very different from when you get Gangnam Style or Idol Dance or Korean dramas, and it's to look at the Korean punk and indie scene, which actually tells us a lot about Korea and about globalization as well. So that's sort of going to be at the end with the documentary, and it'll break things up, hopefully with some different sort of things, some fun today. Okay. Oops. So actually there you see the source book here that we produced, and just the table of contents in the source book, just to give an idea of what is in there, a preface and an overall introduction and raising some of the questions that I've been saying. Let me start off just looking at the institutional contexts of what is going on in the spread of Hallyu and the creation of a cultural content industry in Korea. And then to look at the various operations that go on with the industry. And we decided to divide it up into 4 particular areas. Somewhat arbitrary, but the major, some of them I would say from Hallyu, that the 3 particular areas where we see it operating around the world, as I said, so film, television, particularly through dramas, and so the licensing, the sale of dramas elsewhere, sometimes the sale of formats
of shows that have been successful in Korea and then being franchised to be remade overseas in different places. Looking at music, we didn't do gaming, although we could have. That was, we talked about that, and we decided just to leave that out. Gaming is a bit different. For one of the things about Korean games, and I'll just say this and then leave it aside if you want, that although film, television, and music try to give you a sense, they inevitably convey a sense of Koreanness about them, the games almost try to erase the sense that they are from Korea. They're Korean products, but they become totally internationalized. So you don't get a sense of Korea in the same way. With this, and this sort of overlaps with all three, but one of the really interesting areas when you look at Korean popular culture is it's one of the societies that tells us a lot about the way the nature of celebrity is changing in the contemporary world. Now, just in the last 10 years, there has started to be within academia attention to celebrity studies. There's actually a journal on celebrity studies now. In fact, a friend of mine from I co-taught with at my university, who's now in Australia, and when he first started this up, I thought, like, celebrity studies, oh, come on. But now, as time has gone on, it has come to seem to me a very natural area to be studying because of the way celebrity in the digital world has taken on very new meanings and is circulating in different ways and having a lot of different impacts. And now, on the flip side of celebrity studies, when we look at this sort of work, is there are journals for fandom studies, looking at fan communities. And that's also important with studying the Korean wave. So it's not just a product with this popular culture, but there's a lot that we can say about the reception, how fans go about what they're doing. The fact that it is not just, I think there's this idea from the past of fans as being fairly frivolous or they don't know what they're doing, but it's actually a very interesting area where people make a certain choice of commitment in their lives and are thoughtful about what they do. They exert some agency. And that's probably true of some of your students when you talk to them about how they approach their understanding of Korea. And I'll have more to say about celebrity in a bit. And then we also look at international reception. So there are a number of different areas where it's fairly interesting what happens and how Korea is received differently in different markets. So China is very important, of course, in Japan. We, for the book, actually have Southeast Asia all together, but in fact, Southeast Asia, and especially looking at it here from within ASEAN as the ASEAN Summit is about to go on, and thinking of the great diversity within ASEAN, probably could have had something a bit different for each of the countries within ASEAN. And it's worth thinking about, and I'll have a little bit to say, about how the Philippines approaches Korean pop culture differently from Indonesia, or certainly Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam. There are all these differences as well. And then some stuff about the Americas, Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East. They all have their own ways of approaching it. And then in the book, something else we ended with, and it's hard to think of this as, we didn't know really where to fit it in, but with international reception, what we call Hallyu tourism. So that's actually looking back in Korea, that Korea's tourist market, one of the things that has driven huge increases is that a lot of people go specifically either to visit sites of films or drama, or all of the things that they have become interested in. Also left out of here, it makes its way into the book, but just another aspect of what we might consider popular culture is ideas around appearance and beauty. So you might have heard the term K-beauty. So Korean cosmetics, makeup, plastic surgery, medical tourism, and the like. Just out of curiosity, how many people here have been to Korea? Have actually visited? Anyone? Well, I know that, yeah, there are some people I know who have spent time there. but it's been really interesting to see that that's the way that business is going on. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Now, let's go back to, for me, when Korean popular culture starts to become something very noteworthy, rather than just, yes, part of the fabric of daily life within Korea, but you get a sense that things are starting to move and to change, is in the 1990s, when you start to have a consumer culture that develops in Korea in a very, very substantial way. And I would date that a lot of the changes that we're seeing in Korea and how it has spread its popular culture around the world to this point. And there are a few important things to think about in what happens in that era. So if you look back at the 1990s, and I was thinking that I was going to be speaking to you today after you'd already heard a little bit about Korean history. But what you definitely, one of the things that I'm sure John will be talking about, is that Korea was under a military dictatorship, as you know, from several years. And one of the interesting things, actually, again, thinking of parallels, if you think just about what was going on in the Philippines in 1986 along EDSA, when Marcos came down, the following year, 1987, is when Korea had its opportunity to get rid of Chung Il-kwang, to see that he was pushed out of office and that a democratic election was held. So democratization in Korea led to a flowering of production in popular culture. There was just less censorship and the like, and that also meant some other things that were quite important for why popular culture changed in Korea. When I was first going to Korea in the 1980s, spending time on university campuses, most student culture was based around protest, around the government. People getting together, joining circles, wanting to be out, and to bring an end to the military regime. When that happened, then I think people started to say, well, where do we go next? And there were certainly, it's not a process where Korea suddenly democratized overnight. It was ongoing, and these protests sort of continued. But there's no question that there was a real shift in the interests of young people. And for example, around some of the campus areas where in Shincheon, where Yonsei and Ihwa and Sogan University are, Hongik University and so on, that area of Seoul, you started to see live clubs show up. And people wanting to get, listening to music, things just kind of changing. And also, very important at that point, is there was a liberalization of travel requirements. It used to be really hard for Koreans to get the passports and get authorization to go overseas. And then it just became very commonplace, and people started traveling. And that's great. People become more and more exposed to the outside world, but also with that exposure to the outside world, they're bringing back other influences into Korea. So that's causing things to change. And of course, around this time, and one of the things that drove democratization is that Korea is becoming significantly wealthier through the 1980s and into the 90s. This is the era when Korea was experiencing its great growth, 10%, 8% a year, 7-8% a year around that time. So there's a lot more money around. And that really changes things. And youth money in particular, there's more disposable income that people have. And where in that disposable income is that term, that's helping the rise of a consumer culture as well. Now, in the middle of the 1990s, the President Kim Il-sung made a term called 세계화, sort of the key word of his particular presidency. And there was a real interest in making Korea globalized. You can sort of raise questions about what does that globalization mean. A lot of it was about pushing Korean products out to the rest of the world, connecting Korea to the rest of the world. I think one thing that we can often forget when we use this term globalization is that it is so much a feature of our lives that we have sort of come to think that this term globalization has existed for a long time, forever. But I tried to remember, in fact, it was sometime in the early 90s, I don't know, colleagues, when was the first time you heard the word globalization? It's hard to remember back, but I'm thinking it was probably something like late 80s, sometime around then, and this notion of, we're connecting up in different ways. And one of the things, of course, that gives it a real push is the end of the Cold War, the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so on. And in the 1990s, so Korea is also forming Actually, one of the things I should stop and say here as I go on, and it's indicative, and I'm not sure if anybody is, maybe Naomi talking a lot about North Korea later on, but I'm saying Korea, 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 and we all know that I'm talking about South Korea, right? I mean, that's very obvious. But the fact that I can do that is an interesting one. But in the 1990s, that's when South Korea begins to form diplomatic relations with important nations that it did not previously have connections with, so China and Russia and so on. There is a very well-known moment that happened also in the 1990s under Kim Young-sam that people refer to that seems to be a key in the transformation of Korea's economy and where it has gone. From being concentrated from, if you go back to the 1960s, light industries, sort of textiles, following a fairly common model of development going there, then moving more towards heavy industries, chemicals, shipbuilding, construction, and so on. And I don't think it's apocryphal, I've seen it documented in a few places, that Kim Young-sam had a cabinet meeting where somebody presented figures showing that the proceeds from the film Jurassic Park, which had just come out a year or two before, at that point had brought in as much money as Korea would if it were to sell, I don't remember the figure, something like 2 million Hyundai automobiles is the equivalent of Jurassic Park. And it was kind of a light bulb moment at which Korea said, maybe we should be fostering our cultural industries too to try and help them get off the ground. And so there's much more government support. And some people want to say that that was really the key for why things have gone on. It certainly has helped. It still raises the question of why people like Korean popular culture. Just because you put money in doesn't mean you'll be successful. One of the other things that's really critical to think about in this globalizing world, the way things change, the obvious thing that arrived in the 1990s that's changed, the total game changer, was the internet, the World Wide Web. So I can still remember, I think, the day that I first heard the term World Wide Web. It doesn't seem that long ago, but in a sense it's far more than a lifetime ago. Especially when all my students now are basically digital natives. They do not recall a world before the internet. It's not going to be long before you have students who don't remember a world before they were carrying around one of these in their pockets for the whole life, or something new that will be coming. And these are constant changes that we're seeing, and it's had a tremendous impact. And then finally, again, something specific to Korea that you'll hear more about in other sessions, I assume, is that 20 years ago in Korea, they experienced what is called in Korea the IMF crisis, the International Monetary Fund crisis, or what would be known here, I guess, the Asian financial crisis, because the Philippines were affected as well back in 1998. But Korea's economy really suffered tremendously. But that crisis also gave a sense of opportunity, I think, because Korea developed its own internet capabilities in a particular way as a result of that loss of capacity in other areas, and that's had in effect, and it also led perhaps to more interest again in the cultural industries as an area. So from this time, going back to the 1990s, one of the first stars, kind of a youth star for Korea, where Korea's popular culture also really changes is with Sotaeji. And the boys, people have heard of him. I mean, Korea had its own popular music, throughout the 20th century and songs and the like. But he created a sensation because it was appealing to youth. It was new and fresh and vibrant. It had a lot of influence that came from the West, and you could see the dress early on, that it had these kind of early hip-hoppy type stylings as well. But he was a success financially, economically, but also kind of critically as well. And one of the things he was responding to, and one of the things that really drive, say, a lot of this early Korean youth popular culture is attitudes towards the education system. And you probably know that in Korea, it's very, very competitive in high schools. I imagine saying a bit more, maybe in talking about society, but I would say many people regard the most intractable, difficult problem within Korean society is how to make the education system be equitable, to allow kids to have opportunities and not to feel totally stressed out in their teen years. I'm not sure if this is going to be solved. It's been a pretty constant thing since I've arrived. This is just some quotes from a piece that I assigned to my own students that's online, if you look it up. It's fairly provocative, more an editorial piece than scholarly in some ways. It was with the Korean Economic Institute. But just, I think from my own sense of Korean popular culture, and one of the things in the punk and indie scene early on in particular, is that what was driving it is young people were looking for something that would let them release stress, that would give them a sense of escape from the pressures of their life in the education system. So Sotaeji, one of his big early singles was called, Kyoshi Ide, so the classroom ideology. And these are sort of the lyrics that he sang, and people can't love it, enough of that. Every morning you put us into a small classroom, force the same thing into children's heads. They're swallowing us up. Life is too precious to be wasted here. So this is kind of a new thing that is going on, and to have that occurring in popular culture as well. So that's just a sense of the ferment that is happening with Korean pop culture in the 1990s. Now, one of the things, just looking at the larger context, as you get towards the end of that decade or into the early 2000s, as Korean pop culture does begin to spread, at first it seems like they were marketing their products just around to the region, but certain things caught on in Taiwan and China, and there was a term, the Korean Hangul. So it was sort of a pun on Korean wave, but also cold wave in Chinese. We're starting to get these Korean products that are being popular, and for people to just be aware of them. And around this time is when you have Joseph Nye put out his book on soft power. And looking at soft power as being a critical instrument in how nations reproduce themselves around the world. So hard power would be military and economic coercion, whereas soft power is that if you have something attractive in your culture, you can make people become interested in, you follow your, how you want to proceed and so on. And this is something that Korea is beginning to take up. In Japan and Korea, and then elsewhere, you have the notion of a nation as a brand. So you start to see nation branding projects. And both Korea and Japan have been among the foremost proponents globally of nations that want to engage in sort of a form of branding. There was a very influential article that came out by Douglas and Gray early on, I guess this would be in about 2000, 2001, about Japan's gross national cool. Talking about how Japan, interestingly, Japan started to suffer economically through the 1990s as well. It went into its lost decade, as it's called, and a protracted recession, but the one area where Japan still continued to grow was in its cultural industries. And I don't know how things were here in the Philippines. I assume that it was like through the 90s that you started to get a lot more anime, people become interested in manga and so on. So that's kind of interesting, and people are picking up on that. And so you have the rise in both Japan and South Korea of these cultural industries, and then the governments start to pick up on them and run with it. Now, Japan, so you have this journalist, Douglas and Gray, talk about Japan's gross national cool. And then Japan's like, ooh, we're being recognized for this. And then the government brands it as Cool Japan. And then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gets into the act and wants to send around the world, Cool Japan. Now, the problem is, as soon as you have a government agency declaring itself that we're Cool Japan, it kind of loses its sense of being particularly cool. So that's an issue that's happening here. But also, this is when, from this time in the early 2000s, you start to hear this issue of the Korean wave is coming in. And I'm mentioning Japan here in part because I think Japanese pop culture and Korean pop culture, that there's a lot of interplay. And up to a certain point, I think Korean popular culture was very influenced by Japanese popular culture. It's definitely staked out its own ground. But one of the interesting things that was going on, if you go back about 20 years, is that relations, and again, something you'll be aware of and you'll hear about more detail tomorrow, that Korea experienced colonization from Japan, right, from 1910 to 1945. It was being occupied, and that is still in a touchy issue. I mean, just this morning I was reading something in the paper just about what's happened this past week when Trump was served, dokdo, shellfish at a state. Japan complained about this. So there are obvious issues going back and forth between Korea and Japan. And this broad history between the two plays itself out in popular culture. But there has been a lot of change that's gone on in the last 20 years. So that, in fact, until 1998, Japanese popular culture, the import of Japanese popular culture was banned in Korea. And then there was a progressive lifting of restrictions. And one of the issues with keeping it out, one, it has to do with just feelings of anti-Japanese sentiment. But also, I think, early on, 20 years ago, Korea was worried, if we open up our market to Japanese products, we're going to be swamped because we're not developed enough. Yet everybody here in Korea is going to want the Japanese stuff. We don't want to allow that. So there was a concern in the event that absolutely is not happening. It's going to be trying to get the way around. But when you look back and forth, in Japan, Japanese would look at South Korean popular culture and think it was kind of like watered down, not terribly well-made versions of Japanese stuff. But that's been reevaluated. And then from Korea, there was the opposite. very different relation, is that when Korea looked at Japanese pop culture products, there was some admiration, and even though the stuff was banned, a lot of it was coming in on the pop market and might be, on the black market and be redone. But it was resented as well. But since then, and with all these issues of the historical baggage between the two, there's been a significant reevaluation because Korean pop culture really took off in Japan, most famously in the early 2000s, 2002-2003, with Winter Sonata, a drama that stars this man who is probably, even now I would say, the poster boy of the Korean wave, Bae-young-jun, is his name in Japan, known as Young-sama, who has really been one of the biggest celebrities that Japan has had. He's widely adored within Japan, and as a result of that, it changed the way that many people, and in particular women in Japan, have related to Korea. I'll come back to that in a second. Something else that is happening in the early 2000s and with the spread of Korean popular culture that I think was really significant is that Korea wound up being hugely successful with the 2002 World Cup. I don't know how many of you remember watching the 2002 World Cup. The Korean team did really well, for starters, but it also put on, in a sense, a great global party. And it's also important to remember that that 2002 World Cup, it wasn't just hosted in Korea, but Korea, Japan. But I think the sense from Korea was not only did the team do better than Japan did, but it kind of surpassed in the world's view Japan in the way that it put things on. It was very nationalistic. Here, I think there are a lot of really important things about the 2002 World Cup and its effect on popular culture in many ways. And you can see it here in some of what is going on. So it was nationalistic, and very much so, but trying to bring in other people to come in and help cheer on the nation. The chants, huge flags, people wearing the Red Devils was the name of the team, the uniform, just the chant, Daehanmide, Hanmingguk, Daehanmingguk, and it's still in my head from that time. But what you also saw that's going on is the pop culture is transforming in that there's a sense, this Let's Go Korea, this is the Korea tourism site. Note that you have the Westerner, the foreigner here, with the camera. So this sense of Korea, knowing that it's on display for the outside world and wanting to put on a good show and to give a sense of what its version of Koreanness is, sort of this pop, nationalistic, communal feeling. But what also is happening at the time that's really interesting is the entrance of fashion into it, bringing women in as sports fans, making sexiness part of what is going on. It has had a real impact on popular culture. A lot of people have said also that what was happening is this was one of the key times in Korean culture where there was a clear change in gender roles. It became more acceptable for women to express their admiration for the sexy male players because they were players who were, going for the nation as well. So there are a lot of these things that were happening, and in fact, around this time, probably in some way related to the World Cup, certainly related to Hallyu and the Korean wave, and to people like Bae-young-jun, is notions of Korean masculinity are really changing. And I have this this is from just over a decade ago, but after the World Cup, you have, these are players from the World Cup team, and, with makeup. So they can be hard-bodied guys, really fit, perfect male bodies, but very, cute and soft and wearing makeup. So this is something really interesting, and especially when you think about ideas of Korean masculinity before that time, when men were very macho, very masculine, one thing even now that a main determinant of understanding Korea is the fact that men go to the military. There's forced conscription for 2 years. So men are responding to images like this, but also the fact that they are going into the military as well. So this is one of the, I don't know, an interesting aspect of popular culture and live life, and with gender roles that are occurring in Korea, and these then have effects around the region. I've actually got a new PhD student who is just starting out from last month from Vietnam. He's looking at how conceptions of Korean masculinity are having an impact in Vietnam. I don't know what it's like here in the Philippines as well, whether, you know, some of you guys, if you're wearing Korean beauty products or not. But you have, so men like Baeong-joon becoming well known in Japan, and then Five Players of Rain, just these other examples of soft masculinity that are going on here as well. And I turned up, how am I doing on time? I think okay, so it's already 9:28, and we want to get the document to 11:10, including the document. Okay. I will. Anyway, one of the things that happens, as I suggest, so you get people like Baeong-joon that, and also relating to ideas of masculinity and femininity here, that in Japan, his success was largely among women between their, well, let's say their 20s and 50s, so I'm going to say middle age, but it is extended. But it creates a backlash, because in Japan, not only do you have many people who love the Korean wave, there was a very noted manga that came out, which you would translate as hating the Korean wave. So that you can see that as Korea rises among its neighbors, it can, especially within Japan, it can create negative feelings. So that is something that is happening as well in the early 2000s. Now also in Korea, in its relationship to Japan, one of the further changes that's occurred with the spread of Korean popular culture was around 2010, you started to have Korean pop groups going over, especially girl groups went over, and became very successful. And a lot of the Japanese fans, one, it was a surprise, even to SM Entertainment, who was sending them over. They thought that they were going to be successful with Japanese men. Turns out they weren't particularly successful with Japanese men, but they were hugely successful with young Japanese women in providing a different model of femininity from the Japanese pop groups that they have. So these contexts are important. If you're familiar with AKB48 from Japan, just a very different sense of what girl groups should be. But the Korean media responds to these in quite interesting ways. That the language that you get for Korea to be successful in Japan, it had headlines like this, Korean idols occupy Japan, destroy Japan, but always to the Japan. So the sense of Korea's success is really quite remarkable there. And the governments can be quick to cash in. When Gangnam Style took off, I'll come back to that, I think, you very quickly have these one-day tours to Gangnam that are being set up, where the government wants to, the tourism organization wants to try and just get people in thinking they've got something that's really, really successful with that. Let's see, I'm just trying to think whether I skip over this next section. Any questions? Let's see. I think what I'll do, okay, I'm going to skip over this. I'm not going to. I wanted to talk about this as well. Since I'm staying with this topic, and I'm going to come back later on. So one of the things that has occurred just more recently is with celebrities, you are also starting to see that they can get themselves embroiled in controversies more readily. As Korea goes further out into the world, that they need to market themselves, they're marketing themselves to a more global fan base. So last year, when Girls' Generation was playing in Japan, one of the members, Tiffany, of Girls' Generation, on what was Liberation Day in Korea, the anniversary of their liberation from Japan, she tweeted out something paying tribute to the conference, to the concert the previous night, which had this logo on it. She did this on her Instagram account. And this created a huge problem within Korea. People recognize what that is that's going on? Yeah. Japan's sorry? But it's the rising sun flag, which has these associations with Japanese imperialism. And especially her timing was terrible to have done this on Liberation Day. She was attacked widely online by various fans for doing this, and more broadly in the media. And then she wound up having to apologize, but her apology wasn't seen as enough, and she wound up being sacked from the TV show that she had been on for her ignorance of Korean history and so on. So that's a lesson. That's why you need to learn your Korean history and pay attention when John speaks to all of these things that go on. But it's just a really interesting issue, just the extent to which celebrities are embroiled in these issues, and the way that pop culture has become an important part of international relations in East Asia at this point. So that is something that's going on. And in fact, this kind of issue, these issues of celebritization that have occurred, and is that one of the reasons why people are responding to Korean popular culture and some of its successes results from the fact, and why she got into this controversy, is by posting it to her Instagram account. Fans expect to have a regular connection to their stars, that they have Twitter accounts, they're getting updates. It allows them to feel close to the stars that they're with, and it encourages the stars to almost be their own paparazzi, that they turn around and are constantly photographing themselves in intimate moments of their lives. But these intimate moments expose them to greater risk in a lot of ways. And you start to have a kind of a vigilante culture that exists of people being fans on one side and then anti-fans on the other side. So these are just some of the interesting things. And the interesting with China as well is that China has had a lot of popularity of Korean wave products, but one of the biggest dramas in China in the last couple of years is this one. So My Love for the Stars with Kim Soo-hyun and Chun Ji-hyun. And just the ways in which there can be unexpected effects is that the lead actress on the show is often seen having what's called chimek, so chicken and beer, fried chicken and beer. So that became very, very popular within China in imitation, having Korean style chicken and beer. So that popular culture here is having knock-on effects and causing people to set up new businesses, creating new opportunities that people try to take advantage of. And then what also then happens is, as I said, there's a lot of Hallyu tourism. Tourism from China to Korea became the biggest source of inbound tourism to the country. But what can then happen is then it can be used as a political weapon, because what China did earlier this year, as China and Korea got into more difficulties around the deployment of the anti-missile system that Korea was bringing in from the United States, then China tried to cause tourism to drop to Korea. So a lot of markets experienced quite a drop in their own tourism. So that it has a lot of political implications as well, the relationship of pop culture to politics here. And just another flag controversy. And so one of these things where Korea becomes almost just a place where these controversies can occur that go well beyond Korea. One of the biggest flag controversies of all is the current biggest girl group in Korea is called Twice, you may have heard of. And they're really interesting in that of the 9 members, 4 are foreign. 3 are from Japan, which is the first time there have been a lot of Japanese members in one popular group. And also, one of them is from Taiwan. But when she was on a TV show, they showed them in their room, and kind of innocently, 17 years old, she's from Taiwan, and she just had a Taiwanese flag up. And you would think that may not be such an issue, but in showing this, people in China, commentators in the People's Republic of China, became furious with her, accusing her of being a Taiwanese nationalist, canceling their appearances in China. The company had her apologize. She did make a tearful apology for showing the flag. That caused people back in Taiwan to become very angry that she was coerced to make this apology, which happened just before the Taiwanese election. And it is assumed that this controversy, even though the Taiwanese more nationalist party was likely to win the election, that they appear to have gotten a bounce of maybe 1 or 2 points in the polls as a result of all this. So this is really striking what is happening in the way that there are these other effects with Korea and its neighbors. And just a few more slides in this first half thinking about Korea and its neighbors and the pop culture, and then we'll take a short break. One of the other interesting ways that things that is happening with Korean popular culture is not only is Korea exporting itself to the outside world in its pop culture, we see how the outside world is having an impact within Korea for its popular culture. And what is of interest in Korea, 2 successful shows over the last decade or so. And then one, so Beauty's Chatter in Korea, which is also known as KBS Global Talk Show, which had attractive young women who could all speak Korean from okay to very fluent, and they would come on the show, and there were male panelists, and there would be this kind of a degree of flirtation that went on, and got a lot of viewership. And more recently, there has been a male equivalent of this, which has also been more successful Interestingly or not interestingly or not surprisingly, it has a more serious cast. There's a lot less of the flirtation aspects that go on. But it shows Korea, again, trying to engage with the outside world through its popular culture. And a lot of the guys on this show are very fluent indeed in their Korean. This has been one of the most popular cable shows that Korea has had. But what's interesting, and just thinking about it, you can call these people the new faces of South Korea, but other new faces of South Korea, one you'll recognize, I think, just to think about from here, from the Philippines, is more long-term residents that you have. And so Jasmine Lee, who showed up on the show Love in Asia, which I've got a slide for in just a second initially, and then was in a film, Punch, and very successful, and went on to become a National Assembly woman as well. But you might use her in your teaching just as an example to think about what's going on with Philippine-Korean relations, with the fact that you actually do have a very prominent person in Korea of the Philippines descent. And these talk shows have been interesting, and then another show that's gone on and it's been fairly popular and caught some interest, just thinking of other new faces of South Korea, is this one called Now on My Way to Meet You, which sort of follows the format that you had previously of the Beauty's Chatter, where you get attractive young women who come out, they talk with their host, there's some flirtation that goes on, but what's interesting about these women is they are all refugees from North Korea, and that is trying to help South Koreans understand a little bit of what North Korean society is like. They talk about their lives, but it sets up a particular relationship between North Korea and South Korea as well. And it placing South Korea is made more masculine. Again, you have male hosts, and this idea that a good match is a male South Korean and a female North Korean, which is an idea that goes back in South Korean society as well. And one of the things that you do have with a lot of these productions, I would say, and just again thinking about the way relations with neighbors are created, is that Korea is bringing in Asia into its popular culture, its relationship to Asia more broadly. But one of the things that I think that's trying to happen with this is, from a Korean perspective, it's trying through its popular culture to create a sense of Asia as a region that Korea belongs to. But one of the things that is happening with that is it's hierarchical, that it's setting Korea up as being at the top of its relationships with Asia, and that also Korea is making itself, or has been making itself, more masculinized, and that often when you see, say in here Jasmine Lee again, that Korea is portrayed as modern, and you'll have women coming out in traditional Korean dress as well when this is going on. So this is also creating a shift in how Korea is understanding the foreign, from its earlier history where the foreign was often associated with male invasion, to this idea of the foreign is female and should be assimilated into Korea and into the national fabric. And I think a lot of that may be happening with what's going on with the Philippines. And you have a show like this called Love in Asia, which is an interesting show, and you can find clips that have been subtitled if you want to show to your students, which often they involve couples who have married, with one member who is Korean and one member who is non-Korean. And they always try to get happy couples to do this, although sometimes they'll talk about the problems that exist in their relationship. But it's also really striking that in almost all instances you'll get that it's the male member is Korean, the female member the documentary, just to think about K-pop as well. As I said, a lot of my research is focused more specifically on K-pop. And speaking very honestly, I'm not what I would characterize as a K-pop fan. Most of it I don't particularly enjoy. But there are often songs, there have been songs here and there that I do like. And what I will say is I have found it fascinating, just as a phenomenon to observe. And one of the things I wanted to say earlier about Korea and all of this, and thinking about the successes which Korea has had on the global stage, and as somebody who's been intimately connected to Korea for over 30 years now, I guess I have to feel proud and happy, as much as I often take a critical stance of it. And one of the things I could say, and I'm sure that my fellow experts here, if I look back at Korea from the 1980s, there's a lot about Korea that I would say I wouldn't have predicted. But to think where Korea has come, and for Korea to be a major global exporter of popular culture, I'd be surprised if anybody who was working on Korea in 1989 would have said that come 2014 we'd be where we are today. So how do we define K-pop? And there's some interesting controversies that have gone on. There's a well-known blogger who has a blog, Ask a Korean, where he argues basically that K-pop is all Korean popular music. And I disagree. I don't think K-pop is all the music from Korea by any means. I think it has a much more specific group of music. And we could narrow it down to just sort of idol K-pop. It may be a little bit broader than that. But when we do think about what counts as K-pop, and you probably already have an immediate vision of what you think of K-pop, recent book by Michael Ford, I like his early definition in the opening. It's a hybridized product, thoroughly hybridized. It's bringing in a lot of influences for sure, a unique coalescence of music, visuals for sure, and this is, K-pop visuals. I think that's one of the things about K-pop for me, is that as much as it is musical, it is a visual experience, a visual phenomenon. Lyrics, dance, extraordinarily well choreographed, fashion, a postmodern product of pastiche and parody, getting a bit fancy with the scholarly terms, but there is something postmodern about it. A carnivalesque celebration of difference, a shiny world of escapism. I don't know if that was meant as a pun on the Greek shiny within here. And a highly participatory cultural practice enacted through digital media. And what he means here is that one of the important aspects of K-pop is, as a musical form, it thrives on its relationship with its fans, creating very, very active fandoms, getting people engaged and wanting them to participate within it. And this happens as a result of the digital world and digital media. Another recent book on K-pop, Frank Rowo, Maliankai, and Junbo Che, much simpler, they just call it augmented entertainment. So K-pop is just like, entertainment on steroids or something, a way of thinking out of it. And the way K-pop is spread, and K-pop has really driven what is often called Hallyu 2.0. So you have the first Korean wave in the early 2000s, mostly Korean pop culture products in the neighboring regions in Southeast Asia, often driven by drama and film, music to a lesser extent. But K-pop has really been, over the last 8 years or so, what has made people notice Korean popular culture more generally. It's called Hallyu 2.0. And that 2.0 is both because it is it's a resurgence of the Korean wave, but also it has really, really relied on digital media, like Web 2.0 to go on. And there's been a paradigm shift that has resulted, and if you think about that early Korean wave, what has changed between, say, 2002 and 2017? And a lot of it has to do with new information and communication technology platforms. One of the things that I try to teach with my students a lot to get them to think about the world, and I sort of alluded to this, is how rapidly change occurs and how rapidly change gets normalized. So I didn't have one of these myself until about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And now, it's hard to imagine a world before the smartphone existed. Another one, I would say it is a rare day when I do not look at a few clips on YouTube. And YouTube is now 12 years old. That's not very old either, okay? So everybody in the room is much older than YouTube. Twitter and Facebook as well. Also, central, I don't know how central Twitter is to everybody's life, but for most people, that Facebook is at least involved. And again, penetration of these platforms that have an effect. And because of this global attention to Korean popular culture, K-pop has had an opportunity to take off as well. And said something about the visual being so important to K-pop. And one of the things that has changed and what is different about K-pop as well compared to some other music industries, and again, the music industry in Japan, they still sell a lot of CDs, so actual products, not just digital downloads, but people still buy music in Japan. There's very little of that in Korea. The music industry essentially collapsed on physical sales, and even actual sales of digital music don't do so well in Korea. So instead, entertainment companies have had to find other ways to be successful with their music. And to go back to the idea of celebrities, what happens instead is that with these K-pop groups, they are being marketed not so much for the music that they will sell, but to create an image, to create a brand, where the stars can then either perform elsewhere or and the tickets tend to be quite expensive, and they can go on television shows, make money via TV, and also with commercials, with commercial endorsements and so on. And in fact, celebrity endorsements among advertisements are much, much higher in Korea than they are virtually anywhere else. That something like in New Zealand, only 10 to 15% of our advertisements will involve a celebrity, whereas in Korea it's about 50%, something on that order. So that really changes the way things work as well. Some of my work, which also focuses on gender, has been about interpreting music videos. And this is actually, I think, a really fun exercise you can do with your students. That if you're interested in this, in fact, I'll direct you to just here's a piece that I called Girls' Generation Gender Disempowerment in K-pop, which is in Korea pop culture reader, but trying to read a lot of Korean music videos. How do you interpret them in gender terms? If you want to look at that. Or you can construct your own exercises that might work for you, just maybe videos you would want to talk about with students to help them understand what's occurring in Korea, that would be a way to do it. There's a lot of, if you are interested in reading work on Korean popular culture, just in the last few years, there is more and more that has come out. In 2014 alone, there were about 8 books on K-pop. There hadn't really been anything up until that point. So it's clearly something that people are interested in. Another book that you can probably order pretty readily through Amazon, which is a trade book, is this one by a woman, Korean-American, called The Birth of Korean Cool, How One Nation is Conquering the World Through Pop Culture. And it's a very, very entertaining book. It's very easy to read. She's very funny. I would say I laughed out loud about a dozen times over the course of that book. So it's worth reading. I don't necessarily agree with her interpretations because she is of the view that it's driven by the top down. That the government in Korea decided that they were going to foster its pop culture industries, and there it happened. raises the question of why. And for example here, like this one, Gangnam Style. Why did Gangnam Style catch on? What does Gangnam Style tell us about the world we live in today, about Korean culture more broadly? And this is another one. At this point, for my students, I've been using it, but it's getting to be a while since Gangnam Style came on. I would still describe it as the single biggest viral phenomenon that the world has ever seen. In fact, in the documentary that I'm about to show you, there will be a clip you might recognize that comes from the Philippines. We did it to Gangnam Style right at the very beginning. But students now, already for them, Gangnam Style is something that is kind of nostalgic. But you might use that as a video. There's an awful lot to say. There's an awful lot you can find. In fact, the Wikipedia article on Gangnam Style is a great example of a really good Wikipedia article. It's very scholarly and insightful and interesting. I recommend that you could use that if you then wanted to talk about what is going on there. Just this morning, by the way, because I was curious, thinking about how much of a phenomenon Gangnam Style was. And I imagine people here that it was the same, that the people were talking about it. You'd see things on the news. You may be aware that earlier this year that it lost its status as the most watched video ever on YouTube, that it was passed by See You Again by Wiz Khalifa. However, I just checked this morning, and not only because Gangnam Style still hasn't hit 3 billion views, Wiz Khalifa is like at 3.4, but very quietly, when I checked this morning, Despacito is over 4 billion views. So it's by far now the #1 most watched video ever, and without any fanfare whatsoever, was only released at the beginning of this year, okay? So 4 billion views within the course of a year. But that's really actually quite interesting, because I don't think anybody would talk about Despacito's going viral, right? It hasn't spawned, there have been little bits and pieces of covers, but mostly it's just a pop song that had global success. And that might be an interesting way to think about it. Now that the global music market, the market is global. So a song like that can be viewed, and it's probably popular. Yeah, it's popular in Asia, Latin America, obviously, Africa, North America, Europe. So that's just a very different example. But Gangnam Style, I don't know. I'm kind of curious to hear what people think. What accounts for its success and why it became the singular phenomenon that it was. And I still do think it is a singular phenomenon. And the difference between Despacito and Gangnam Style still is if you look at all the phenomena around Gangnam Style, all the parody videos, the cover videos, the things that you wouldn't even imagine. If we put in, and I'm not going to do it, into YouTube, Gangnam Style Philippines or Gangnam Style Manila, I bet we would get 1,000 hits each. And that some of those videos have probably been watched 2 million times. But if you add up all of the videos that go along with Gangnam Style, it's probably well into the tens of billions of hits, maybe even approaching 100 billion. There's a lot. But why? What happened? Anybody have thoughts on how we explain what you might talk about students if you were looking at Gangnam Style?
Well, I guess the reason why Psy,
Yeah.
this Korean has been quite popular, not only in Korea but also in other Asian countries, including in Europe, or even if this Gangnam Style, video that he had went into the other parts of the world. Well, that is because the world is already ready to accept Korean culture, Korean entertainment. Something that was that's something that did not exist in the early 70s or early 80s or even 90s. It is only right now that probably Korea is being accepted, or Asian entertainment probably is already being accepted in the world. Well, Despacito, something that has to do with Spanish and Mexican. This has been there even in the 70s. It seems to be that people are already fed up with that, but now they are returning in partnership with Korean entertainment. I guess that's my thought right now. I mean, this is how I would interpret it.
I would say one of the important things is that idea that people were ready to accept a song from Korea.
Yeah.
That probably was that there was a bit of a buzz
Something that
in Korea that people were starting to hear it. So the site comes out July 2012. By 2009, 10, 11, you're starting to see stories here and there in global press about K-pop. And so that people are sort of primed. And in this study, and in fact it's a study from, I don't think it's from Ateneo, but maybe from UP, a woman did her master's thesis on K-pop in the Philippines. And one of the things she says about people who accept, who are interested in K-pop, they have been primed in some ways. A lot of them have been previously fans, say, of Japanese anime and manga, or had some experience in that way. So that's definitely a factor. So what else? What's some of the other things?
I heard the steps are easy to learn.
Hey, okay. There's something, the world may have just been waiting for another dance craze that people can do communally. But a lot of those songs, you know, we're just waiting for a horsey dance. I think there's something to that. that definitely played a role in its success. What else? I mean, one of the things, just what I mentioned before, it happened in 2012. It could not have happened even just a few years earlier, in, say, 2005. I think its virality, one, we need the platform, so we have YouTube in place. Okay, so people can view this broadly. We have Facebook, so a lot of what was going on is people are sharing this among friends, so you can have nodes going off. Have you seen this yet? This is great. And then you've got Twitter as well. And again, with maybe people being primed, that what Twitter had just come into being. And there were a few particular celebrity tweets, and for Britney Spears was one, saying, this is great, you guys should see this. So when people, celebrities who are already well known, point to this Korean star, you can actually see in the view counts that there were noticeable spikes around that time. And then it started to take on a life of its own. That said, I think that there's something about the video, too, that's going on. I remember the first time that I saw it with my daughter, and she who had already been exposed to plenty of K-pop. But when I saw it, I was viewing it as, I would say, the way somebody from within Korea would view it. And it's a very funny video within Korea, because there are a lot of celebrity cameos in that if you know Korea and Korean popular culture, it's very funny from within a Korean perspective. But it was something very catchy. My daughter, as I said, she'd seen a lot of K-pop, but she was pretty indifferent to it. But as soon as we watched it, she said, Daddy, put that on again, because she wanted to see it again because it was so funny. And so I think people within Korea really liked it, but even obviously people from outside would know some of the scenes, like when the elevator opens in Nohongcheon. That's his little bit that people from outside of the country will think it's funny. If you're within Korea, it fits his personality so well that it's even funnier. So that's some of the other things that were occurring. What else? Any other thoughts? I think there's even more. What's interesting about it, there are multiple layers. Yeah. Yeah, the beat. Okay, catchy beat, but there are so many songs with catchy beats. Maybe that's a necessary condition, but it doesn't explain it. I mean, if it had been a song that people didn't like, that wouldn't happen. Although I have probably heard people say that they find certain aspects of the music being kind of annoying too, but some people do find, it's catchy, for sure. Yeah. You're going to say something? Yeah.
So I have just noticed in the music video, although it's K-pop, the music video contains elements of an American pop music video. For example, we usually see women in R&B songs in the US. And same with the Gangnam Style, if I remember it correctly. There's a lot of masculinity there on the bottom side. He's being surrounded by a lot of women, which from a feminist perspective is it's commodification of women. But American music, American pop songs, the music videos of American pop songs, it always has that element. There's this male pop singer. He's being surrounded by a lot of sexy women dancing around him. And I have observed that element in the Gangnam Style music video. So although it's K-pop, but it's still westernized, the elements of the music video. A lot of jokes and pranks.
The jokes, yeah, and taking that, and actually what's happening, suppose it is, there's interesting stuff with gender roles, and the song is about, if you know the lyrics, or the one little, there isn't much English, but the one that people, hey sexy lady is in there. You have, but it's meant to be comic. He's sort of mocking himself. And it's the kind of woman that I like. The woman who one-shots her, her coffee, or is it he's the guy who can down his coffee in one shot. There's certain funny lines that are in there as well, and the performance having Hyuna in there, the girl on the subway train that he goes up to. So yeah, those are other aspects that are in there. But I think one of the things that lent itself to going as viral as it did, just think about the name, Gangnam Style. What does Gangnam Style mean? What's it refer to? So it's a place. So that people very quickly started parodying it, because then you could do Ateneo style or Manila style. And so a lot of people did that, and there are so many little discrete moments in the video that it's easy to think of your own take on it that will place a localized stamp that connects you to this global phenomenon. And in fact, one of my, I'm not going to go into much detail at all on this, but my research and one of the things I say about why K-pop has been so successful and why it has its fandoms is it allows fans to create a strong sense of local community that connects itself to something that is seen as trendy and cool that comes from somewhere else. And there's a lot of that. And before just going to an intro to the documentary, let me just say something about some of my work here. One of the problems with looking at K-pop, and again, I was just looking at something this morning in preparation for here in the Philippines, and it used the very phrase, K-pop is clearly storming, the Philippines. This idea that, it's this really strong, powerful force that is just overcoming us all. But it's not. I really don't see it that way. For fans, it's a very important part of their life. But the reason that people think of Korean popular culture as storming another country as being this powerful invading force is because it's new, because it's unexpected. People have not thought that popular music would be coming from Korea, so they notice it. I think that that's a lot of it. We don't talk about Despacito storming the Philippines in the same way. It just is something that is happening. But the media, and it's not just Korean media, but media on the outside, want to draw attention to it as a noteworthy new phenomenon. From the Korean perspective, there's a lot of this idea of Korean popular culture conquering the world. Look how great we are. It makes us feel more successful. So when we hear about this, it gives us a sense of K-pop that I don't think is actually in keeping with the nature and the extent of what's going on. And one of the other issues about understanding this is I think it is true to say that Gangnam Style was an extraordinarily viral phenomenon. But people then say, well, that's K-pop. and then you have idol fandom, which is the real standby for K-pop fandom, and put them together and say this is why K-pop is conquering the world. But I don't think that's the case. So Gangnam Style was really successful. But what we have is K-pop fan interest. And this, I think you will see, is ongoing and does exist. It exists among your students. I don't know what percentage, actually I am kind of curious, what percentages of your students would be noteworthy K-pop fans? Probably different than coming to Ateneo. If you're specifically coming to study Korean, then you're here for a reason, so it may be almost 80% or 90%. But in high schools, at a typical high school in the Philippines, what percentage of students are 5%, 10%, 20%? I have no idea. Is it? Do most of your students there are very few, or most? Is it that most are familiar with it, or most are active fans?
Most of them are in high school. Most of the students are
Active fans of K-pop.
They really buy the music, they really buy stuff related to their K-pop idols.
Okay.
I guess one of the reasons, or a follow-up answer to this comment here, one of the reasons why Filipinos are really interested right now in K-pop, that is because we are being flooded also by these, how do you call it, soap operas, which we call telenovelas, soap operas of Korea. So they relate well with soap operas here, and so by the time they would, think that these actors or these artists of which they would adore in soap operas are part of this K-pop or e-singers, they go crazy on these people. But by the time that they come here on a concert, they're going to scrimp on their savings and buy tickets just to see these people, just to see them sing, just to see them dance.
I mean, if I had the time and just doing research, I'm really curious. I would want to find out a bit more about your high schools. Most of you are from Metro Manila?
Yes.
So this is one of the things I'm curious in whether you were coming from high schools with people are more middle class or upper middle class, and whether that has an effect in looking around, and if we went out to the provinces, whether this level of K-pop would be, penetration would be the same. These are questions that I have more as a research on what's happening with K-pop. And schools, because I certainly accept that maybe you're from schools where 75% of the students really do listen to K-pop and are fans. But I don't know. These are the sorts of things I'm interested in looking at. And in fact, just before going to the other PowerPoint, just one other slide. This is from 2011, just before Gangnam Style came along and K-pop really exploded. It's really interesting to see where YouTube videos were going and where was K-pop the most successful. This is a really interesting graphic. Now, when you look at that, actually, does anybody have any comments on this, or what you would say about this? And when it tells us about the spread of K-pop, you need to use it fairly carefully. Yeah, it looks like Japan and the US, the places that are red. But the problem, actually, the coloring of that video, the way that it works, it looks like it's biggest in Japan from that. Or even the US. Just because you look at Thailand. But what it, in fact, I think is more important here, and why you need to treat this with care, is you want to divide it up by capita. Like what is the overall population to get an idea. And if you do it that way, it really changes things a lot. So that it's not inside the US by any means, but actually the most successful markets up to that point had been Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So the other members of the so-called Four Tigers, if you remember that term, the East Asian Tigers, and also the Chinese-speaking ones, the ones that were maybe the most close to Korea culturally. And actually something that I haven't really talked about, I haven't gone into, an interesting thing about Korean, the spread of Korean popular culture, why has this occurred? It used to be that people would talk about the Korean wave as being a result of cultural proximity. So that the countries nearest to Korea, they feel close to Korea, and that's why they've been the most successful, say, elsewhere in Northeast Asia, and then, okay, Southeast Asia. In fact, as you go on in time, oops, yeah, this one too, this is for searches of K-pop, of the term K-pop, and you probably can't read it or really see it that well, unfortunately. But this spike is about 2012, where Gangnam Style comes out. Then it starts to dwindle. And overall searches for K-pop have gone down. And again, you need to be careful because the search for K-pop as a term has gone down. Because people sort of know K-pop. They're not looking up K-pop on Google. They tend to look for particular groups. And that's held a bit more steady over time. But what I want to point out here is in 2015, the countries that were the biggest, if you can see, number one was Indonesia for interest in K-pop, Malaysia, the Philippines came in number 3, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. So what you really pick up here is that cultural proximity maybe, but the biggest markets seem to be Southeast Asia and Muslim countries. And if you get a Southeast Asian Muslim country like Indonesia and Malaysia, that's where the biggest interest in K-pop has been. And it's hard to speak of cultural proximity between South Korea and Islamic countries. But in fact now, as tourism from China has dropped in Korea, they're more interested in marketing to a lot of Muslim countries and making sure that they have more halal, so food that will be suitable for Muslims in Korea. That's just happened in recent months. So those are some interesting points. Yep.
Is it because you said that K-pop is more, how do you call it? There is a bigger market for them to see in Indonesia, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, or in the Middle East. Is it because this region is, the people are very conservative and they're now open to, they wanted to see more action, they wanted to see more an active kind of entertainment.
One of the explanations that's often been given for its popularity is these are places that want to partake, are within a global modernity, but are turned off by North American sort of Hollywood, U.S. hegemonic culture as being too sexualized, and that K-pop, although it's become more sexualized, it will be sexy but not sexualized in the way if you think of seeing videos, something that would be really over the top, and or Korean dramas, that in a lot of these market Korean dramas, because families, they have family values, you can sit around, you won't be embarrassed if you watch it with your mom, in the same way, I don't know, that you might not watch Sense in the City with your mom or whatever. So those are, Anyway, before the documentary, let me try to go through this super quickly. I guess we can cut into a little bit of a question time just to be able to say something. So, I've been talking about K-pop, and I want to introduce you to another side of Korean popular culture as well that's nearer to my heart. And I first went to Korea in the 80s and had my most extended experience studying at Yonsei University in 1989, 1990, coming from UC Berkeley, where I was a grad student in classics, as it happens, actually. Was doing a different field, but had become very interested in Korean literature and wanted to get into Korean literary translation. And that year was great. It changed my life. It's why I'm here in front of you right now. And almost everything about that year was great, but the one thing for me that was not great at all was the music you would hear ambient in Korea at the time. So we're talking about K-pop. This was before K-pop even existed. This was before Seotaeji. This is when Korean popular music had a very different feel to it. So you would either hear Korean stuff or sort of Western soft rock, which wasn't really my thing. I liked music with more energy and bite. And there was a day when I heard the same song by the Carpenters playing 3 times. It was Rainy Days and Mondays, and I thought, oh my God, I cannot stand it anymore. And I started to wish for the magic power that I could point to speakers and then they would spontaneously combust. And that didn't happen, unfortunately, but almost as miraculously to me, Korea did have all of these changes that I've been talking to you about in the 1990s. And in 1998, I was back on research leave at the Academy of Korean Studies, and before I went over, a friend of mine, a historian, Mike Shin, said to me, Steve, if you're going back, you should go check out this club in Hongdae, in the area of Seoul, called Drug, because I think you'll really like it. And I went in, and within 30 seconds, I knew that I had finally found my spiritual home in Korea, because they were playing this loud, energetic music. People kind of, saw me, came in, give me big smiles, welcomed me, started chatting. I was really enjoying things. And so punk rock had come to Korea. And I'm like, wow, this is really great. And I was going kind of as a fan, and from the Academy of Korean Studies to get up to Hongdae was a good hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes each way. So it was like a pilgrimage for me to be doing that 2 or 3 times a week while I was there. But the whole time I was like, this is really fascinating. Why do we have punk rock in Korea when I couldn't even have imagined it in 1989? And it led to research some of the things that I've already been talking to you about. But one of the things I thought would be even better to do that would be to make a documentary on this, to just help show the scene to a larger world. And I contacted a friend of mine, Tim Tangolini, a colleague of John's at UCLA, and Tim was really the perfect person to work on this with, because Tim is also a scholar of Korea. He is interested in visual anthropology. He had already made a documentary himself, but probably the most important thing, he's one of my best friends, and in grad school we had been the rhythm section of a punk band ourselves. I played bass, and Tim was the drummer. So we got together in Korea in 1999 for 3 weeks, did the filming, and then put this documentary together. I'm going to skip that because I've explained that something about the lyrics with the music. But the early punk scene, just to say a little bit more about globalization and the changes in globalization before showing you the film, that I've noted how globalization is a term that came in sometime around late 80s or early 90s. And we often use the term a rapidly globalizing world. And I think it's okay to still say that we live in a rapidly globalizing world, but what rapidly globalizing means now and what rapidly globalizing meant in the 1990s are a bit different. Because what Korea was trying to do in the punk scene, I think in the early 90s, globalizing meant taking global influences and trying to indigenize it. That is, try to make things Korean. It's like, hey, we're going to take punk rock and we'll make it Korean. So the first CD from the bands in the scene was called the Chosun Punk compilation, Korean punk compilation in English. And so the band names were in English, but almost all the song lyrics were in Korean. And you've got some Korean here, but otherwise, okay, you've got this lettering and an interesting use of the term Chosun for Korea, calling it Korean punk. Chosun is a term that goes back, looks back, as you'll see, to the Chosun dynasty. Korea, South Korea now calls itself Hanguk. And they didn't want to call it Hanguk punk. They thought that was kind of dull, so they'll call it Chosun punk, sort of real Korean punk. And it kind of is archaic. The font that is used here looks a little bit like North Korean style. And North Korea still calls itself Chosun. But the most interesting thing here is on the cover. So they're having punk music, but they have this great icon of Korean nationalism. People know who that is? Lee Sun-shin, yeah. So Admiral Lee Sun-shin, who's a hero for warding off the Hideyoshi invasions of the late 16th century. But here he is welcoming this foreign influence into Korea with the electric guitar instead of holding his sword. It's like saying we're taking punk and we're making it really Korean. But by the next compilation that came out just about 6 years later, things were already changing as Korea is continuing to globalize. And instead of it being we're the Korean punks, it's we're the punks in Korea. That's in smaller, the Korea is in smaller lettering, it's in English. And if you look at these people, well, sure, they're Korean. I mean, you look like they're not Japanese, you don't know. But you definitely know that they're punk in the way. That's what the declaration of identity is that is occurring within this. And on the liner notes, they pay attention to this as well. This time around, they're in English. One of there's an American guy who plays in the band who says, I like that this is the title. It's not we are the Korean punks. Like, I can be part of it too. And as you'll see in the documentary that I'm about to show you, it's kind of confronting opening, and it raises a question of what is Korea and how do we understand Korean punk right now, because it was filmed in California when a Korean band went over there, but it's a white guy who was talking about the foreigners with some colorful language who come to the shows in Korea, sort of complaining about that. So I'm going to skip over these slides. So Korea, again, Korea and Japan, important connections. When it first starts to go overseas, it goes to Japan and you start to have some festivals. And one of the things that's been really interesting, even with the punk scene as it has started to grow, and why Tim and I made a sequel, is our first one just focused on the community at this early punk club. But then we started to see, wow, all of these bands are beginning to tour overseas. And they're doing so because K-pop has become so popular. And so we were looking at how these bands relate to what is happening with the arrival of K-pop and so on. And what does their music tell us about the Korean society more generally? I'm just going to skip through these. But one of the interesting things that's happening is even the independent music of Korea is taking part in global tours, which are being branded around this idea of being Korean. So for the last 6 years, there's a company that has set up these tours, and they're calling themselves Soul Sonic. Time's off and soul in there as well, sending bands over. They've been playing, you may not have heard of South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, but it's the biggest independent music festival in the world. And now they're having Korean showcases that are there. And what's interesting here is each year they brand themselves as 2K15. So 2K15, well, the K is obviously 1000, so 2015, but it's also obviously Korea, and using what I've come to call it special K. K-pop, K-drama, K-fashion, and so on. So here it is, that magic letter K again, to give a stamp. Now it's, people might want to come and see something from Korea because they're aware of it. And up in the corner you can see that it's Koka proudly presents, so that's the Korean creative content in this agency. So they're getting government support for what they're doing as well. So that's a really interesting thing. Again, independent musicians getting government support, how independent do you become? So that's some of what is going on with what's happening here. And I think I am just going to end with this and show it because we're starting to get behind the time. So, I'll show you the second documentary in what I think is going to be a trilogy. So Tim and I already have plans afoot to make one last documentary looking at the globalization of Korean popular culture and to do so through the independent music scene. And I was in Korea last month, and right at the beginning of October, end of September and October, there's now, Korea's got its own big independent music festival where bands come from around the world to Korea. And what we're thinking we'll do is we're going to film some bands at this festival as well, talk about their experience, how they understand Korea, and then follow some Korean bands when they go to South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. So that's going to be the final stage of all of this. But what we're seeing is that globalization is becoming more and more messy and more interconnected. And that you have these very intricate webs of people traveling all over the place. And just even in the short time I've been speaking to you, people have mentioned and thinking of all of the multiple ways now that Korea and the Philippines have these connections with each other. So that all sorts of nations have their own little bilateral connections with one another, but then they become part of regional connections and global connections as well. And you can get some real surprises. I mean, one real surprise, I had a great time at this festival, and it was great to walk in the very first 5 minutes I was there standing outside a club, seeing, in fact, the Jeff and Trash, who we meet in the documentary, but then somebody from Canada who'd flown over with his wife, who was originally from Turkey, whom he had met in Korea when they were both interested in this sort of indie music, and they were back for the festival. And then a woman who blogged from Sweden about Korean indie music, and she showed up in there. So there are people coming from all around the world who have these connections and have particular interests.